On the morning of the 8th of January, 1966, at exactly 0900 hours, Corporal Bob Kearney stood at the very precipice of a nightmare. He was positioned at the edge of a jagged, irregular puncture in the Vietnamese jungle floor, an opening so narrow it was barely wider than his own shoulders. This was not a natural sinkhole, but a deliberate, hand-carved shaft dropping straight down into a vertical abyss of absolute, lightless silence. From somewhere deep below the roots of the ancient trees, he could hear the faint, haunting cadence of voices. They were Vietnamese whispers, echoing up through the dark throat of the earth. Kearney looked toward his patrol commander, Captain Bryan, who offered a single, resolute nod that served as an unspoken order. Without hesitation, Kearney began to strip away his bulky webbing and heavy gear, knowing that even a centimeter of extra equipment would trap him like a cork in a bottle. He checked the smooth action of his Browning pistol, clicked on the beam of a small angled flashlight, and began to lower himself feet first into a darkness that reeked of damp soil, stagnant sweat, and a metallic tang of fear. As his boots finally struck the floor 3 meters down, a chilling realization hit him. This was not a simple fighting position or a temporary shelter. This was a doorway. The tunnel branched out in 3 distinct directions, each passage so low and cramped that a man could only navigate by dragging his belly through the grit. Somewhere in this sprawling, subterranean labyrinth, an invisible enemy was waiting with held breath. What nobody in the American High Command realized that morning was that beneath the Hobo Woods lay more than just a hiding place. It was a subterranean city, a hidden metropolis of resistance featuring hospitals, tactical command centers, and munitions factories extending over 200 kilometers. In some sectors, this fortress was carved 3 levels deep into the iron-hard clay, a structure where thousands of Viet Cong had lived, worked, and planned for years without ever being spotted from the air. 23 Australian SAS operators were about to become the first Western soldiers to truly breach this underworld and grasp the terrifying nature of the war they were actually fighting. The official military history of the era remembers Operation Crimp as a conventional, textbook success. It records 8,000 American troops being deployed, a massive tunnel network being uncovered, and the mission being marked as accomplished in the after-action reports. However, the reality within the suffocating soil was far darker and more complex than any bureaucratic file could convey. In the 72 hours that followed Bob Kearney's first descent, a handful of Australians would disappear into that underground world and discover a truth that fundamentally altered the very DNA of modern warfare. They would learn a hard lesson. You cannot bomb what remains invisible, and you cannot destroy what exists beneath your very feet using traditional means. The Americans, with their rigid and expensive doctrine of overwhelming firepower, would never fully grasp the revelation born in that absolute blackness. They believed that enough explosives could solve any tactical problem. But the Australians discovered that sometimes the answer to an impossible situation isn't a massive airstrike. Sometimes the answer is a single man armed with nothing but a pistol and a flashlight, willing to crawl into the mouth of hell itself. This realization, forged in the cramped and lightless passages, would create a legend that terrified the enemy more than any B-52 strike could ever hope to achieve. This is the true story of how 23 men entered the underworld and emerged as ghosts. To understand why this mission became a turning point, you must first understand what Operation Crimp was supposed to be on paper. 3 weeks before the launch, American intelligence officers briefed General Jonathan Seaman, commander of the 1st Infantry Division. They had identified a high-value target, the Iron Triangle, a 30-square-kilometer area northwest of Saigon believed to house the elusive military Region 4 headquarters. The American plan was massive and elegant in its brute force. They would conduct a helicopter insertion of 8,000 troops in a single morning, establish a suffocating cordon to seal all exits, and then sweep through systematically, destroying everything in their path. The theory was simple. The Viet Cong would be trapped and forced to either fight or surrender. Either way, the iron triangle would be erased from the map. Yet when the Australian liaison officer, Captain Mike, heard the briefing, he asked the one question that made the entire room pause. He asked, "What if they simply go underground?" The American briefing officer, confident in his maps and technology, shuffled his papers and replied that they had identified a few spider holes and would use combat engineers to collapse them. Mike, however, had seen the intelligence reports from the communist insurgency in Malaya. He knew that these were not just holes. They were extensive living systems. He asked if the tunnels had been mapped, or if anyone knew how deep they went, and the answer was a resounding no. Mike made a silent note to bring tunnel clearance equipment, men trained for claustrophobic environments, and hundreds of spare flashlights. He knew that if the enemy went beneath the earth, someone would have to follow them, and that someone would almost certainly be an Australian. January 8th arrived with a roar as the helicopter armada assembled in the early morning light. Hundreds of aircraft took to the sky, their rotor blades creating artificial storms of dust and debris as they launched the largest air assault since the days of the Normandy landings. 8,000 men were on the ground in less than 2 hours. The cordon was established, the perimeter was locked, and the systematic sweep began. By mid-morning, American patrols started finding the first signs of the network. Initially, they appeared to be simple, isolated spider holes. The procedure followed the textbook: throw in grenades, set off demolitions, collapse the entrance, and move on to the next objective. But then, they encountered something that defied the manual. They found a tunnel entrance that refused to collapse even after a massive blast of explosives. They doubled the charges, yet the structure remained stubbornly intact. 300 meters away, another patrol discovered a new entrance, then another, and another. By noon, the commanders realized with a growing sense of dread that they had discovered 50 separate tunnel entrances in just a single square kilometer. These were not individual positions. They were the breathing vents of a massive connected organism. Nobody knew how deep the system went or how many soldiers it concealed. American engineers attempted to flush the system. They pumped thousands of cubic feet of tear gas into the dark openings, but the gas simply dissipated, filtered through hidden ventilation shafts that the surface troops couldn't even locate. They poured thousands of gallons of water into the holes, attempting to drown the occupants. But the water drained away into lower levels and secret sumps that the Americans didn't know existed. They used massive cratering charges that shook the very foundation of the jungle, but the tunnels were buried so deep that the structural damage was negligible. By the second day, a heavy cloud of frustration settled over the division. They had 8,000 troops and tens of thousands of pounds of high explosives, yet they had achieved almost nothing of tactical value. The enemy had simply dissolved into the mud beneath their boots. It was at this moment of strategic failure that Captain Mike proposed something radical and terrifying. He argued that instead of blindly destroying the tunnels, they needed to map them. He explained that they were treating the complex like a bunker, but it was actually a network, and every network has a logic, a set of choke points, and central nodes. If they mapped the city, they could find the heart of the enemy. The Americans were deeply skeptical. Mapping required men to spend hours in the airless dark, exploring passages that might collapse at any moment or be defended by a desperate enemy. It was a mission of extraordinary suicidal danger. But with no other options on the table, the Australian SAS received the call. Corporal Bob prepared for the first true descent. The entrance he chose was a masterpiece of deception, a shaft hidden inside a massive, functioning termite mound. The Viet Cong had incorporated the living insects into the camouflage to mask the human scent and heat. Bob approached the mound slowly, shining his flashlight into a hole that descended 3 meters to a horizontal passage. The air rising from the hole smelled of cold earth and something organic, not quite the stench of rot, but the heavy, humid scent of many bodies living in a confined space. Captain Mike's briefing was short and clinical. He needed to know the extent of the system, the location of booby traps, and whether the complex was currently occupied. Bob nodded, stripping off his shirt and gear because the narrow walls wouldn't allow a man in full uniform to pass. He checked his Browning, clipped a flashlight to his pocket, and tied a safety rope around his ankle. 3 sharp tugs on the rope would mean an emergency extraction was required. An American soldier, standing at the edge of the hole with his rifle held tight, whispered that he wouldn't go down there for $1 million. Bob looked up at him with a cold, detached expression and replied that it was a good thing they weren't offering. Then, he vanished into the darkness. Inside, the walls were eerily smooth, expertly carved out of the dense clay. The shaft angled slightly as it dropped, a deliberate engineering choice to make it impossible for anyone on the surface to drop a grenade directly to the bottom. When Bob's feet touched the floor, he found himself on his hands and knees in a passage with a ceiling only 70 centimeters high. He chose the right-hand path and began to crawl. His flashlight beam cut through the heavy air, revealing wooden supports placed at perfect intervals. This was professional, industrial-grade construction. After 10 meters of agonizingly slow movement, the tunnel opened into a chamber 2 meters square, high enough for a man to crouch. In the dim light, he saw the remnants of daily life, sleeping mats, cooking pots, and a ventilation shaft hidden in the ceiling. There were Vietnamese slogans carved into the walls and fresh footprints in the dust. He photographed every detail with a small camera, then moved deeper. The passage branched again, and the temperature began to rise. The air grew thick and wet, making every breath a struggle. He found more chambers, some filled with sacks of rice, others with medical crates and ammunition. He discovered a workshop containing weapon-making tools and a small hospital wing with bamboo beds and surgical instruments still laid out on a table. The Viet Cong weren't just hiding here, they were thriving. This was permanent, unyielding infrastructure. Bob had been underground for 20 minutes when he heard the voices. They were coming from directly ahead. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, and killed his flashlight. In the absolute crushing blackness, the voices became crystal clear. There were at least 2 men talking in conversational, relaxed tones. They were not alarmed. They had no idea that a predator was moving through their home. Bob faced a devastating choice. He was alone in a space where his weapon was almost useless. If he engaged, the enemy had every advantage. They knew the layout. They could move in the dark, and they could collapse the exit behind him. But his mission was reconnaissance. He needed to know the strength of the force ahead. He inched forward, his pistol in his right hand and his flashlight in his left, his finger light on the trigger. The voices grew louder, and he saw a faint, flickering glow coming from around a corner. They had light. He crawled within meters of the opening and very carefully peered into the next chamber. What he saw would be studied by intelligence analysts for decades. The chamber was 5 meters square and high enough to stand in. It was occupied by at least 12 Viet Cong soldiers who were sitting in a circle, calmly eating rice and talking. Their weapons were stacked neatly against the wall. They were relaxed, enjoying a meal in their underground sanctuary, completely unaware that an Australian was watching them from just 3 meters away. Bob didn't fire. He knew he could perhaps kill 3 of them before they reacted, but then he would be trapped with 9 angry soldiers between him and the only way out. Instead, he did the hardest thing a soldier can do. He turned back. He retreated inch by inch in absolute silence until he was far enough away to turn around. He crawled back through the maze, memorizing every junction, counting every branch, and building a 3-dimensional map in his mind. When he finally emerged into the blinding daylight 45 minutes after entering, the Americans stared at him as if he were a ghost returned from the afterlife. Captain Mike asked him what he had found. Bob's answer changed the course of the entire operation. He told them it wasn't a base camp. It was a fortress, and that the ground they were standing on was merely the roof of a city they couldn't destroy with bombs. Within hours of Bob's emergence, the entire nature of the operation underwent a fundamental transformation. General Seaman's staff realized they were not merely clearing a jungle, they were attempting to besiege a subterranean kingdom. The problem was an existential one for the military. How do you fight an adversary that you cannot see, cannot target with artillery, and cannot locate on a standard topographical map? Captain Mike's radical proposal was formally approved, and over the next 36 hours, the Australian SAS conducted what remains the most perilous reconnaissance mission of the entire war. Working in silent pairs, these operators entered the tunnel systems at multiple points across the sector, systematically exploring the depths. They carried only the essentials: pistols, flashlights, notebooks, and cameras. They moved through passages that had not seen a single ray of light in years. They discovered hidden worlds that took their breath away. In one sector, they stumbled upon an underground hospital with 30 beds, still occupied by wounded fighters who scattered into the side passages like startled shadows as the Australians arrived. They found a heavy industrial factory equipped with lathes and specialized tools for the manufacturing of mortar rounds. They found a printing press, still warm from the production of propaganda leaflets. Everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of long-term, sophisticated habitation. Personal photographs pinned to clay walls, handwritten letters from home, and intricate decorations carved into the very earth. This was not a temporary hiding spot. This was a home for these fighters, engineered with a level of sophistication that defied Western imagination. The ventilation systems were completely invisible from the surface, with air shafts cleverly disguised as natural features, or those termite mounds. They tapped into underground streams for fresh water and reinforced their meeting chambers with heavy timber. They even built false chambers and dead-end traps designed to lure searchers into collapses. During one of these descents, Corporal Mike discovered a passage that dropped even further to a second level. The tunnels were layered in a three-dimensional grid. On that second level, he found a command center with maps still pinned to the walls, functioning radio equipment, and cups of tea that were still warm to the touch. The occupants had fled only minutes before he arrived. As the Australians mapped the network, the data they brought to the surface was shocking. The system extended over 25 kilometers in this single sector alone, containing over 300 individual chambers on multiple levels with at least 50 distinct entrance points. It was a realization that explained how entire enemy units could vanish during a sweep. They didn't retreat into the hills, they simply went beneath the American boots, where they could remain for weeks, supplied by hidden caches and protected from the heaviest artillery. It was a problem that firepower alone could never solve. The enemy could simply wait for the Americans to grow tired and leave. But the Australians discovered a subtle, psychological vulnerability. In the tunnels, the Viet Cong felt a sense of absolute security. It was their sanctuary, their womb. Because they believed they were invulnerable, their guard was often down. They cooked, they slept, and they relaxed in ways they never would on the surface. Captain Mike realized that if you could violate that sanctuary, if you could make them fear their own fortress, you could break their will in a way that 1,000 bombs never could. This realization led to the most disturbing and classified phase of the operation. On the third day, the atmosphere in the tunnels shifted from reconnaissance to hunting. It began with an enemy soldier named Tran, who was moving through a familiar passage when his flashlight caught the glint of a thin wire stretched at ankle height. It was a booby trap, but not one of his own. Someone else had been there. Someone had set a trap for the trappers. Further down the junction, he found a sentry with his throat cut expertly from behind. Tran realized with a jolt of pure horror that someone was hunting them in the dark, someone who moved as comfortably in the earth as they did. A small Australian SAS team had requested permission to conduct disruptive operations. The concept was brutal. If the enemy feels safe in the tunnels, make them terrified of the dark. They entered the passages not to map, but to kill. They moved in total silence, using captured uniforms to confuse sentries and their newly acquired knowledge of the layout to predict where guards would be posted. They would switch on a flashlight for a split second, fire 3 rounds into a target, and then vanish back into a side passage before the echoes had even finished bouncing off the walls. Within 2 days, captured prisoners were reporting that their units were refusing to enter certain tunnel sections, claiming they were haunted by pale ghosts who moved in the black. When Operation Crimp finally ended on the 14th of January, the Americans claimed a strategic victory with 500 enemy killed and a massive complex uncovered. But the true impact was the psychological scar left on the survivors. Captured documents from months later showed that enemy commanders had issued new, desperate orders. The tunnel systems were no longer considered secure. They were forced to rotate sentries constantly and avoid any section where the Australians had been reported. A sanctuary had become a tomb. Yet, the cost to the 23 men who went down into that darkness was immense. 6 weeks after the mission, Corporal Bob sat in a briefing room at Nui Dat, supposed to be training new arrivals, but he could not focus. He was plagued by nightmares of passages that twisted back on themselves and voices in the black that wouldn't stop whispering. He was not alone. 17 of the 23 operators reported severe sleep disturbances, crippling anxiety in confined spaces, and intrusive thoughts. The absolute darkness had triggered primal fears, and the intimacy of killing a man so close you could hear him breathe had broken something in them. Historians struggle to capture why this specific operation was so damaging. In a regular firefight, there is distance and noise. In the tunnels, there is only the wet sound of a blade or the muffled pop of a pistol, followed by a silence that weighs 1,000 pounds. You are utterly isolated, with no support and no option for retreat. By the time the war ended, 4 of these men had been medically discharged for their mental state, and 3 others left the military entirely within a year. 2 others eventually died by suicide, casualties of a war that followed them home from the hobo woods. The tactical lessons from Crimp shaped the rest of the war, proving that an enemy could be defeated through superior psychology rather than just brute force. But the question remains, when we ask men to descend into the mouth of hell to hunt humans in the dark, what do we owe them when they finally emerge? The legacy of those 72 hours is not found in the tactical brilliance of the maps, but in the heavy silence that still hangs over the veterans who survived it. Some things are born in absolute darkness, and perhaps that is where they should remain.